Judge mocks black woman in court, shocked to learn she's a genius attorney in disguise. The air in the Los Angeles County Courthouse hung heavy, thick with anticipation and the stale scent of old law books. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, their murmurs a low, constant hum that vibrated through the room. At the defendant's table, a figure seemed almost swallowed by the sheer weight of the proceedings. It was Odessa, a black woman who looked to be in her mid-50s, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Her posture was relaxed. Her age and the color of her skin made her easy to dismiss, an easy target. Judge Walter Grayson, a man whose career had been built on quick judgments and dismissive glances, leaned back in his chair. His fingers drummed a lazy rhythm against the polished wood of his desk, his gaze sweeping over Odessa with undisguised amusement. "Well, Ms. Dawson," Grayson drawled, his voice laced with condescension. "Do you think you can give me a coherent explanation for what happened?" A ripple of chuckles spread through the courtroom. From the bailiff to the stenographer, even the prosecutor, they all sensed an easy win. Odessa didn't flinch. She had spent decades preparing for this moment, though never imagining it would come with her on this side of the bar. Her entire life, she'd listened and watched. Her mother, Denise, had been a cleaning lady at prestigious law firms, and Odessa had grown up amidst whispered legal jargon, discarded case files, and the unspoken biases that ran rampant within those hallowed halls. She knew the courtroom's rhythm, the lawyer's tricks, and the judge's prejudices better than most. "Let's not waste any time," Judge Grayson sighed, flipping open the case file with a sigh. "I have a lunch reservation to keep." More laughter, more confirmation that Odessa was nothing more than a nuisance to be quickly dismissed. But Odessa's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dangerous igniting within them. Grayson had just made his first mistake, underestimating her, and the courtroom was about to witness the consequences. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose with the practiced air of a man who had never lost a case. His suit was impeccable, his tie perfectly knotted, his voice a smooth, rehearsed baritone. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Odessa Dawson, was apprehended in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Lexus, reported missing just hours before her arrest." Carrington paused for effect, letting his words hang in the air. "Officers pursued her through downtown, where she allegedly attempted to evade arrest before finally being apprehended. Her fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution contends that the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed like blows, each one designed to paint Odessa as a criminal, a thief caught red-handed. Judge Grayson glanced at Odessa again, his amusement deepening. This was going to be even easier than he thought. "Go on, counselor," Grayson urged, his voice dripping with impatience. Carrington approached the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the courtroom floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this is all a misunderstanding, that Ms. Dawson is an unfortunate victim of circumstance," he said, turning to lock eyes with Odessa, his tone dismissive. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim leads the police on a high-speed chase?" The tension in the room tightened like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, his gaze fixed on Odessa. She remained still, her expression unreadable, a stark contrast to the nervous energy swirling around her. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Hayes, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle before she attempted to flee," Carrington announced, holding up a stack of papers. "The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Grayson exhaled slowly, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me." And to most of the people in the room, it probably did. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. The case seemed open and shut. But Odessa had spent too many years observing these proceedings, seeing the subtle cracks in the facade of justice. She waited, watching, allowing the prosecution to build its case, knowing that the stronger it seemed, the more devastating her response would be. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Odessa's court-appointed lawyer, Rowan, a young, timid public defender who looked as though she'd rather be anywhere else. Rowan rose to her feet, her hands trembling slightly. Your Honor, my client. Odessa placed a hand on Rowan's arm, a silent gesture for her to stop. Rowan hesitated, her eyes wide with surprise, then slowly sat back down. For the first time, Odessa spoke. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The room erupted in a stunned silence. Judge Grayson stared at her, his amusement quickly turning to disbelief. You'll what? Odessa's voice was calm, standing and ready, resonating with an unexpected authority. I'll be defending myself. A murmur swept through the courtroom, disbelief and disdain swirling through the air. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up, and Carrington's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. This should be interesting, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But no one was laughing when Odessa took her first step forward because everything was about to change. The weight of the courtroom settled around Odessa as she adjusted her stance, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She allowed the silence to stretch, amplifying the tension and making them uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms, a gesture that betrayed his underlying unease. Go ahead. Odessa took a slow step forward, her gaze unwavering. You stated that Officer Daniel Hayes personally saw me behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle before I was arrested, correct? Carrington exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. That's right, and that testimony is written in his official report. Of course it is, Odessa said, nodding slowly. She turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Grayson squinted at her, his confusion evident. On what grounds? Odessa pulled her hands apart for the first time and gestured towards the prosecution's table. Because Officer Hayes never saw me in that car. He wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Odessa took another step forward, her voice gaining momentum. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Hayes' GPS logs from that night. If his report states that he witnessed me in the vehicle, then his location history should corroborate that. But, she paused, letting the word hang in the air. I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, disbelief and speculation swirling through the air. Judge Grayson frowned, glancing towards Carrington, his expression hardening. Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Odessa gave a small, almost casual shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't... She let the sentence trail off, her meaning hanging heavy in the air. Grayson studied her for a long moment, then turned to Carrington, his eyes narrowed. Counselor, does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Carrington hesitated, a barely perceptible pause that spoke volumes. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, the judge noticed. Odessa took a quiet breath. She had spent years watching these proceedings, studying prosecutors, their tactics, and the way they manipulated the system. She knew that if Carrington was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple wearily. Carrington finally shook his head, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. No objections, Your Honor. But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing. The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable, a storm brewing beneath the surface. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence cracking around the edges. Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Odessa gave a small nod, her face unreadable. That's true. She took a step forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Grayson raised an eyebrow, gesturing for her to continue. Odessa turned to the jury, making eye contact with each one of them, her voice calm and measured. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. She paused, letting her words sink in. But let's think about this logically. She took a deep breath, her tone remaining calm and controlled. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. She gestured. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances, a ripple of murmurs spreading through the gallery. Odessa didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a grocery store hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with a friend, and yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. She continued. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. She paused again, letting her words hang in the air, then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, she asked, Does touching something make you a criminal? Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. But Odessa wasn't finished. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done. She turned to Grayson. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington, who hesitated, then reluctantly shook his head. No. Odessa's lips pressed together, her eyes hardening. So, let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis? Carrington's jaw tightened, his face flushed. Odessa nodded as if that was all she needed to hear. Interesting. Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He realized that this case was not the easy one he had assumed it would be. The tide was turning, shifting in Odessa's favor, and he could feel the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him. But Odessa wasn't done yet, because the next thing she was about to say would change everything. She took a slow step forward, her voice steady but firm. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Judge Grayson frowned. The owner? Odessa nodded. Yes, Mr. Noah Ellis, the registered owner of the stolen Lexus, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why. She turned to Carrington, her eyes narrowed. Do you recall what Mr. Ellis told officers the night his car was reported stolen? Carrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming. Odessa didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, she pulled out a printed transcript from her file and read aloud, her voice clear and resonant. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the woman you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was Latino. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, the air thick with shock and disbelief. Odessa held the paper up, displaying it for all to see. That's from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. She turned back to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer admitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington stepped forward, scrambling, desperate to salvage his case. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. Odessa shook her head, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. No, I wasn't. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after running errands. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the jury, her voice filled with conviction. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple, his face etched with weariness. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone in the room knew it. The evidence was crumbling, the prosecution's case dissolving before their very eyes. Odessa turned back to the jury, her voice resonating with the weight of her experiences. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black woman in the same general area and decided that it was close enough. That's what this case is really about. She looked around with intensity. Silence descended upon the courtroom, broken only by the soft rustling of papers and the hushed whispers of the spectators. Grayson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington stood stiffly, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. No, Your Honor. Judge Grayson exhaled, the sound heavy in the silence. He looked at Odessa for a long moment, then glanced at the jury, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would reverberate through the courtroom, changing the lives of everyone present. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence hung in the air, followed by an eruption of chaos. Half the courtroom erupted in disbelief, the other half in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, their eyes wide with excitement. Odessa didn't move, allowing the moment to settle, letting the reality sink in for everyone present. She had done it. She had exposed the flaws in the system, the biases that had nearly condemned her. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel, looked at Odessa with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, recognition, perhaps even regret. He had underestimated her, judged her based on her appearance, her age, and her race, and he had been proven wrong. Odessa met his gaze, her eyes conveying a mixture of triumph and weariness. She turned to leave, her shoulders squared, her head held high. But just as she reached the door, the judge spoke again, his voice hesitant, tinged with a newfound respect. Ms. Dawson? Odessa stopped but didn't turn, her back to the judge, her posture still radiating strength. Grayson hesitated, then finally said, You should consider law school. A slow smile spread across Odessa's face, a flicker of amusement dancing in her eyes. She didn't need to consider it. She was already on her way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices, the atmosphere charged with excitement. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Ms. Dawson, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? Odessa pulled her coat around her, ignoring the barrage of questions. She wasn't interested in the spectacle, the fleeting fame that came with this victory. This wasn't about proving how smart she was, it was about something much bigger. Her mother, Denise, was waiting for her at the bottom of the steps, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment she just looked at Odessa, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and concern. Finally, she shook her head and let out a breath. Odessa, you scared me half to death. Odessa chuckled softly, scratching the back of her head. Had to take a risk, Mama. Denise stared at her a moment longer, then pulled her into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras kept flashing, but Odessa wasn't paying attention to them anymore. She was focused on her mother, on the years of sacrifice and struggle that had led to this moment. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Grayson watched the scene unfold. His posture was different now, the arrogance gone, his shoulders slumped with a newfound humility. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine, just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now he knew he'd remember this one. Because Odessa had done something most people never could, she had made the system look at itself, and for once, it had blinked first. The immediate aftermath of the climax rippled through the courthouse and beyond. The media pounced on the story, dissecting every angle and analyzing every detail. Odessa Dawson, the unassuming black woman who had outsmarted the system, became an overnight sensation. The dismissal of the case sent shockwaves through the local legal community. Judge Grayson, once regarded as a rising star, faced scrutiny and criticism for his initial handling of the case. Doubts began to surface about his impartiality and his tendency to rush to judgment. Carrington, the once confident prosecutor, retreated into the shadows, his reputation tarnished, his future uncertain. The weight of his misjudgment, his arrogance, and his reliance on flawed evidence bore down on him. For Odessa, the victory was bittersweet. She had proven her innocence, but the experience had left her shaken, acutely aware of the prejudices and systemic biases that pervaded the justice system. She spent the next few days fielding calls from reporters, lawyers, and activists, each eager to hear her story, to understand how she had managed to turn the tables on a system that seemed designed to crush her. But Odessa wasn't interested in fame or accolades. She was focused on something bigger, on using her experience to help others who had been wronged by the system. She reconnected with old acquaintances, reaching out to legal aid organizations, offering her insights, her knowledge, and her unwavering determination to fight for justice. She knew that her case was not an isolated incident, that countless others were trapped in the same web of prejudice and misjudgment. Denise, her mother, watched with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew that Odessa was embarking on a long and difficult journey, one that would demand all of her strength, her courage, and her unwavering belief in the power of justice. One evening, as they sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset, Denise turned to Odessa, her eyes filled with love and admiration. "You know, baby, you always had a fire in you. I knew you were destined for great things." Odessa smiled, taking her mother's hand in hers. "I learned from the best, Mama. You taught me how to be strong, how to fight for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you." As Odessa reflected on the events of the past few days, she realized that her journey was just beginning. She had opened the door and shattered a barrier, and now it was her responsibility to keep pushing forward, to pave the way for others who had been silenced, marginalized, and forgotten. The image of Judge Grayson, standing by his car, his face etched with reflection, lingered in her mind. She knew that her actions had forced him to confront his own biases, to question the assumptions that had guided his decisions for so long. Perhaps, she thought, her case had sparked a change in him, a willingness to see the world through a different lens. But whether or not he changed, Odessa knew that she couldn't rely on others to fix the system. She had to be the change she wanted to see in the world. She had to use her voice, her knowledge, and her experience to fight for a more just and equitable society. Years later, Odessa Dawson stood in a courtroom once again. But this time, she wasn't the defendant. She was the attorney, a seasoned advocate, her presence commanding respect and attention. She had gone to law school, excelled in her studies, and dedicated her life to fighting for the underrepresented and the marginalized. Her passion for justice burned brighter than ever, fueled by her own experiences and the countless stories she had heard from others who had been wronged by the system. As she delivered her closing arguments, her voice resonated with conviction, her words carrying the weight of her past. She knew that her journey was far from over, that the fight for justice was a never-ending battle. But she was ready. She was prepared to face any challenge, to overcome any obstacle, to continue fighting for a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. And as she looked out at the jury, she knew that she wasn't alone. She had inspired others to join her cause, to stand up for what's right, and to challenge the status quo. The seeds of change had been planted, and they were beginning to blossom.